Now, I have the pleasure of introducing our first keynote speaker, Dr. Alicia Danforth. Dr. Danforth began her work in psychedelic research with Dr. Charles Grobe in a pilot study of psilocybin therapy with cancer patients. Together with Dr. No sound. Okay, here we go. Together with Dr. Grobe, she recently finalized a pioneering pilot study on MDMA-assisted therapy for the treatment of social anxiety in autistic adults. She is currently lead clinician for a trial at University of California, San Francisco on psilocybin-assisted group therapy for long-term survivors of HIV and AIDS. She's also a clinical psychologist with private practice in Silicon Valley, California. Ladies and gentlemen, a warm welcome to Alicia Danforth.
Thank you. Good morning, and thank you so much, Philip, and to the entire team that has made this event possible in such a beautiful venue. I first met Philip back in the summer of 2016, and at that time he shared with me the growing interest in psychedelic psychiatry in Sweden. And he asked me at that time at an event in the Netherlands if I might be interested in coming to Sweden someday to speak to a group of about 30 people. So here we are. Okay. The insights that I'm going to be sharing with you today were made possible through collaborations with many of you in the room today, and in particular, Drs. Charles Grobe and Brian Anderson. And I'd like to extend my thank you to those of you that have contributed to the body of knowledge on psychedelic psychotherapy. I also would like to give a brief mention to the organizations that helped fund the research, make it possible through private donation, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies and the Hefter Research Institute. So today, I'm going to be speaking about the art and science of psychotherapy. There are many ways to define psychotherapy, but none are very precise, but I'll give it a try just for our purposes today. As I'll be speaking about psychotherapy, I'm referring to a structured process that is typically supported by a theoretical orientation and research, generally provided by skilled and qualified clinicians and psychotherapists who engage in a boundaried therapeutic relationship with clients or patients to address psychological problems and to improve quality of life. It's generally initiated with a period of assessment and evaluation, including taking a personal history, followed by treatment, and carefully transitioned to a close. I'm going to be speaking about psychotherapy as it's practiced in Western medical and academic research settings. And it's not my intention to diminish the relevance or importance of other traditional as well as contemporary health and healing paradigms. In California, where I'm from, and in most states in the United States, just about anyone can call themselves a therapist. Psychotherapist is a protected term, and it refers to someone who holds a current license with a state licensing board. The practitioner can't advertise their services as a provider of psychotherapy until after supervised training and passing exams, which include training in law and ethics. Training in law and ethics is important when working with psychedelic medicines for reasons I'll go into in more detail later. So recently, around the time I began preparing this talk, someone asked me what I thought about the potential of studies in which participants are anesthetized and given high-dose psychedelics. My inner scientist was intrigued. I thought to myself, yeah, that might be interesting and contribute to general knowledge. My psychotherapist self was deeply disturbed, and I reflected on why I had such a strong visceral response to this suggestion. So psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy is a challenging topic to address broadly. And some of you here today actually know far more about it than I do. And some of you will be learning about it for the first time. So in this talk, I intend to provide pragmatic information as opposed to theory. And I hope to include more or less something for everyone. So it was not long after my initial conversation with Philip in Amsterdam when I was speaking at an event in New York. And at the time, I was transitioning off one clinical study without a firm commitment to begin another. And an audience member asked me about my thoughts on whether or not I thought psychedelics would someday become legal prescription medications. And in a spontaneous moment on stage, I shared my fear that working in private clinical practice without psychedelics would at times feel like being a firefighter who couldn't bring a fire hose to the fire. And that has been the case as I've begun my private practice. Sometimes I find it very difficult to sit with a client's pain when I cannot offer psychedelic-assisted therapy. I have a lot of tools. I can be helpful, but I miss having that fire hose sometimes. With the exception of providing psychedelic support in festival settings, I've never worked in the underground, but there are days when I feel very tempted. Since Michael Pollan's book, you may have heard about it, How to Change Your Mind, was published in May of this year, I've received dozens of emails from people who've described complex trauma and serious mental illness who are desperate for treatment with psychedelics. Some imply in their messages that they consider psychedelics as their last hope before suicide. I'm also contacted almost daily by students and clinicians who want to begin working with psychedelic medicines as quickly as possible. There's a lot of enthusiasm. I'm frustrated that these medicines are not already available, but I also agree that the process should proceed cautiously. I have concerns that the risks associated with well-intentioned but unskilled and unsupervised underground therapists is increasing. As a researcher, I can pick up the powerful tools of psilocybin or MDMA, but only about 10 days on average out of every year. This experience has taught me what other researchers have observed, that these medicines are non-specific amplifiers. They enhance healing potential, and they also amplify what can go wrong. So just like firefighters need to know how to use each tool, psychedelic psychotherapists need to hone their skills as well. Psychedelics place people in highly suggestible states, increasing vulnerability to exploitation. Psychedelics can also be used to do harm. Even in a controlled setting, just like when fighting a fire, unexpected things can go wrong. And psychedelic psychotherapists need to know how to respond to, for example, when spiritual emergency occurs. How do you tell the difference between a spiritual emergency and a true psychosis? Severe symptoms of psychological distress, such as high impulsivity, suicidality, anxiety, depression. Psychedelic psychotherapists need to be able to recognize psychopathy and sociopathy. They need to know what to do in the event of a severe panic response or acute severe paranoia. Those are some examples. They also need to know how to work with transference and countertransference. So part of what we're doing at this event is the work of sorting out how to optimize these powerful tools and techniques. I'm asked this question somewhat frequently. Maybe some of you have had this discussion. Whatever your views, are you prepared to support your answers? Assuming that it's a given that in psychedelic psychiatry, training and proficiency, professional ethics and techniques matter, there's still a need to refine our collective discernment about when and which type and how much psychotherapy is indicated for each population and each individual. So I might, at the risk of offending some people in the room, this cartoon describes what I feel like sometimes when people ask me the question, why include psychotherapy? Along similar lines, I'll share an anecdote from something I overheard at Burning Man one time. This guy was boasting to a group of burners out in the desert. He said, "I've been doing psychedelic support at Burning Man for over a decade." And a senior ranger in the back said, "So I see, you've been doing it for about 10 weeks then." So consider this response to that question of whether or not the psychotherapy is necessary. What if one is not added to the other as a supplement? If neither the medicine nor the psychotherapy has primacy over the other, but they really belong together. I was very, very encouraged when I reviewed the program for this event because the lineup of topics looked so balanced. Embracing science broadly. The basic and the applied sciences are represented in these talks. The inductive and the deductive. It's inclusive. Values, purposes, meanings, and qualities are on an equal footing with measurements, mechanisms, molecules, and quantities. Feminine and masculine approaches are balanced. And in Stockholm today, we're walking with both feet instead of hopping on one foot, which is a positive trend. As I was typing up my slides and saw these two phrases on the screen, I realized that we often use the former. You often hear about psychedelic-assisted therapy, but what about therapy-assisted psychedelics? And in sitting there contemplating a little more deeply, I'll just share with you from my personal experience as a researcher so far, I realized that working with MDMA, in my limited experience, feels a bit more like psychedelic-assisted therapy. And working with moderate to high-dose psilocybin feels a little bit more like therapy-assisted psychedelics. Just a subtle little nuance to play with there. So there's a spectrum of need when it comes to psychotherapy, ranging from microdose, I don't know if you can see, there's a guy with a little garden hose, up to working with serious mental illness. You may need a highly trained and skilled team. Why is it important in some instances to have trained and qualified psychotherapists? It helps to have individuals on the team who understand personality disorders, for example, and what those individuals need to strive towards optimal health. Deception can occur at intake. On the MDMA-assisted therapy study for social anxiety with autistic adults, we actually had a reality show actor who tried to fake being autistic to get into the study. You need to be able to assess for and respond to suicidality. You need to be aware of indications of transference and have an awareness of your own countertransference. And it's important to know how to make appropriate referrals to aftercare in research settings. It's essential to have a network of qualified referrals who understand the psychedelic experience. Peer groups might not be sufficient in all instances. Sexual misconduct has been problematic in psychedelic science from the early days, and it continues today. It's important to get training in the law and ethics and boundaries around sexual conduct. It helps to be accountable to a licensing board. It's also helpful, depending on the type of psychotherapy being provided, to have individuals who are skilled in individual therapy, couples therapy, group therapy. So there's a spectrum of need. Okay. Borrowing on a concept from my colleagues Brian Anderson and Emily Williams, just as researchers are working to determine the optimal dose of the medication, we're also working to determine the prescription or dose of psychotherapy for each indication, population, and individual. In other paradigms, mentorship on how to work with psychedelic medicines might begin in youth within a particular lineage. Skilled shamans and healers determine the dose for each individual at the time it's presented. In some traditions, it's difficult to imagine that in the Western medical model, but there might be some benefit. For example, in the group therapy study with psilocybin for long-term HIV and AIDS survivors, we had one individual who was psychedelic naive, and we realized that with their body weight, the dose might be too high. So we were able to revise the dose before treatment to a lower dose. So that kind of flexibility can be important. So, what are participants in these studies saying about the role of psychotherapy? Not long ago, I came across a Reddit post, and this question was posed. If you don't mind me asking, what was the procedure like, and how would it be replicable in non-clinical settings? And to my surprise, one of our study participants had posted on Reddit and said, hey, I was in this study. And he indicated that replicated outside of the clinic, it's hard for me to tell. The therapist was most helpful as an integrator/facilitator, and just to have a nice person with me while I did it. Doing it alone would likely result in markedly less positive impact. The MDMA was very much just an aid to the general process of psychotherapy, or therapy, to my earlier point, MDMA-assisted therapy. Yes, without a therapist, I'd still have felt good, pleasant, calm, but I'd have no one to go to help me integrate, make sense of, and construct a narrative afterwards. I'm going to pause for a moment and just look at that term, integrate. We hear a lot of talk about integration these days. As I understand it, integration is a process following psychedelic-assisted therapy to enhance recall of insights, imagery, feelings, motivation for change. It can be enhanced when there's a somatic component, for example, providing a copy of the music playlist that was played, providing a transitional object that they can remember the session, journaling, ways to get an embodied recollection of what it was like to experience the medicine. So interestingly, this participant has shared with me in the years since treatment, this post was this Reddit post came 3 years post-treatment. This individual was diagnosed with Asperger's in his childhood, and that diagnosis was confirmed for enrollment in the study. They've enrolled in graduate school to become a licensed psychotherapist, and they began seeing their first clients under supervision about 2 weeks ago. And they mentioned participation in the study in their grad school application, and they aspire to work with psychedelics in clinical research. Just a little aside. Also, I want to mention that the experienced psychedelics users that we've spoken to, when asked to compare what it was like to do it combined with psychotherapy, even the really experienced trippers say, this was different. I'm going to read to you just another quote to give you a sense of how the participants perceive the role of the psychotherapy. This was from a male participant in the pilot study for psilocybin-assisted therapy for anxiety reactive to late-stage cancer. After treatment, Dr. Grobe got a note, and he said, "I just want to drop you a quick missive and thank you for the work that's been done with my psyche. I'd feel hard-pressed to walk away with more deep experiential learning. The work that the researchers are doing might not be right for everyone, but for the ones that can handle and learn from it, it's a godsend." And I want to point out that this individual they were a burner, lots of experience with psilocybin, and after the medication, they said, well, it was a good experience. I don't really know what I got out of it. But working with Dr. Grobe to analyze some of the imagery came up. He had an image of driving around Burning Man in an art car that looked like a hamster. And on his journey across the playa in the hamster car, he had a vision of an ideal woman. And at the time, his ex-girlfriend was living with him as a care provider. I'm at liberty to talk about this because I had his full permission before he died. He wants this story told. And he had the frustration of his former girlfriend then dating a friend of his and coming over to the house in his space where he's trying to relax after cancer treatment. And Dr. Grobe asked him, this vision that you saw, did she remind you of this ex-girlfriend? He said, no, nothing like her. And he realized that this situation was not ideal for him. And his biggest concern as he was facing death was that he would never have an opportunity to be intimate with a woman again. And with Dr. Grobe's help in integrating the experience, he went out, found a beautiful, loving, wonderful girlfriend for about the last year of his life that he survived after treatment. But he wouldn't have had that realization, or he might not have, without that opportunity to process it with Dr. Grobe. So there's a taste of what some of the participants are saying. What are the data saying? In preparing the manuscript for the MDMA study for social anxiety with autistic adults, I was typing up an early draft, and in describing the effect size or the degree of difference between the pre- and post-treatment group, I wrote that the Cohen's d effect size was very large. And I sent that off to our one of the sponsor authors, and we're always cautious about sounding like we're biased, zealous advocates. So after I sent it off for review, it came back looking like that. Okay, fair enough, but that's not accurate. So I made an edit, and I sent it back off for review. And it came back. So this is an indication that the science team at MAPS is very conscientious about not appearing overly biased. So I had to send the draft back with a citation included. I cited Sailovsky's paper that added a few categories and made the point, very large is technically correct. Don't change it again. So for those of you that are interested in the research and the science, I'm very quickly going to give you an overview of the 3 studies that I've had an opportunity to work on. The first being the pilot study for psilocybin-assisted therapy for late-stage cancer. Dr. Grobe, who will speak later this morning, was the principal investigator. And I'd like to state right from the start, I was not a psychotherapist on this study. I did not engage in psychotherapy because I was not trained as a psychotherapist at that time. That didn't mean that I didn't have a role on the study as a supportive presence, a female in the room when somebody wanted a comforting feminine presence, but I didn't provide any psychotherapy. It was a safety and feasibility study. that was then expanded upon with larger study populations in the trials that followed, the phase 2 trials at NYU and Johns Hopkins. In our study, there was one primary psychotherapist and 2 psychotherapists for the medication session, so it was a triad, 3 people in the room. Within subject blinding, everybody had 1 psilocybin and 1 niacin placebo session. The dose was fairly low, in part because this was the first study that in the recent resurgence of psychedelic therapy with psilocybin for cancer patients, and the FDA wanted the researchers to err on the side of caution. So we weren't working with a real high dose, just an N of 12. So what was the psychotherapy? What seemed appropriate for this population was existential psychotherapy. Dynamic approach to addressing basic conflicts that flow from the individual's confrontation with the givens of existence, as opposed to reflecting back on prior history or resolving, inner conflicts in sort of a Freudian sense. Existential psychotherapy allows for deep personal reflection, enhanced by periods of solitude, making time to reflect, and creating freedom from the distractions of the experiential world. This was a good match for people who were near death. Some of the themes in existential psychotherapy include death, freedom, isolation, meaningless, and a big part of the work is around meaning making. We use the classic eye shades and headphones model for the medication sessions. This therapy was appropriate because it was brief and flexible. Sometimes Dr. Grobe did sessions over the phone for individuals who were too ill to come in or who had traveled from out of state and weren't available to make frequent trips back and forth to Los Angeles. So there were 3 on average, 3 pre and 3 post psychotherapy sessions of around 60 to 90 minutes each. In comparison, for the pilot study of MDMA-assisted therapy for social anxiety in autistic adults, also a safety and feasibility study, maybe looking for a signal around efficacy, but basically right out of the gate you're looking to see, is it safe? Is it even possible? We had 1 primary psychotherapist and then 1 co-therapist who joined for the medication sessions in the male-female dyad. 2 double-blinded medication sessions. They received either MDMA or an inactive placebo. And we looked at the dosing. We chose a dose escalation study because we weren't sure if doses that were shown in research to be effective for non-autistic individuals would be appropriate for this population. Everyone tolerated the various dose levels, but we started with the 175 milligrams that we thought would be the minimal dose to have therapeutic effect based on prior research. Also an N of 12. But existential psychotherapy would not be a good match for this population. We had to think, what will work for autistic adults? And there was almost no literature. It's a very understudied, underserved population. But I found a couple studies that showed that mindfulness-based therapies can be effective with autistic individuals. And I had training in dialectical behavioral therapy, or DBT, and realized DBT was developed to help individuals with a borderline personality disorder diagnosis to help them with interpersonal effectiveness, emotion regulation, and distress tolerance. Those are 3 domains where autistic adults struggle as well. So we adapted the core mindfulness module, which was structured, based in handouts, something that was much more comfortable for autistic individuals as opposed to the classic open-ended questions. If you say, how was that for you? It rarely works for autistic thinkers. We had 3 preparatory sessions and 3 integrative sessions after each medication session, and they ran about 90 to 180 minutes each, because the 90-minute hour tends not to work for autistic individuals who may have a slower style of communication. So the point I'm making is the psychotherapy needs to be flexible to meet the needs of the population you're working with. So this therapy is structured at times, but during the medication sessions, we had both structured and unstructured therapeutic content, because putting someone, in eye shades with headphones for the whole time isn't necessarily the best approach when you're working on social anxiety. So we adapted the set and setting for autistic preferences. And finally, the pilot study of group therapy with psilocybin for demoralization in long-term HIV/AIDS survivors, also safety and feasibility. 2 co-lead therapists for group. In the medication sessions, there's 2 therapists and 1 of the group leaders who's already had an opportunity to establish rapport with the participants is present in each medication session. We've had both male and female dyads and same gender dyads. There's no need to get wedded to this idea that you always have to have the, what's been the more or less standard, for a long time, male-female dyad. It's not necessary for all populations. 1 open-label psilocybin session, the first group got the lower dose, the second 2 groups of 6 each got the higher dose. And Dr. Brian Anderson got the fantastic idea to see what it would be like to provide psychedelic-assisted therapy in a group therapy model. So he adapted supportive expressive group therapy, which was developed for breast cancer survivors. This type of therapy has a focus on the here and now, openness, mutual support, and emotion expression. And one of the lovely things about this type of group therapy, contact outside of the group is encouraged, which has proven to be very therapeutic for this group. There are 4 preparatory meetings in advance of the group therapy. And to give you a sense of the value of the therapy, in a focus group after the first round, they said, we want more therapy. So in the second 2 groups, we had 6 instead of 4 integrative sessions. We did use the classic eye shades and headphones model, but there was a lot of variability in the interactions with the co-therapists across the medication sessions. We don't insist that they keep the eye shades and headphones on the whole time. So I'm wondering, after a student of mine wrote about an experience of participating in a group ceremony in the Native American church, he enlightened me to the idea that in the ceremony he participated in, the whole group was journeying on behalf of 1 member in that group. What would that be like in contemporary Western psychiatry? Could we evolve to implement models in which treatment groups journeyed on behalf of the benefit of 1 of the members each time? So can we move in gradual steps from an emphasis on individual health and growth to healing the collective? Very briefly, what were some of the common elements in the psychotherapy across all of these studies? Open and close with a secular ritual, focus on intention setting, at least 2 skilled clinicians present for each medication session. We used music. Eye shades and headphones were optional and encouraged, but not mandatory. And I want to say a word. Oh yeah, I did mention a word about integration. Refine that a bit. The idea being we work to reinforce, recall, meaning-making, and applications of insights gained to daily life. Okay. Briefly, and I don't have a slide for this, I just want to bring to your awareness some of the common challenges that required clinical insight. Intentions for the session can change abruptly mid-session. For example, we've had participants who expressly stated they wanted to do trauma work in a session, and unexpectedly, we didn't see it coming, the session may take a quick turn, and that individual may be thrown into the midst of doing deep grief work for previously unaddressed grief. So you need people in the room that can switch it up very quickly. You can't catch everything at intake. Clinical insight and experience reduces the likelihood of contributing to conditions of hopelessness. Need people to know what to do in case of acute panic or paranoia responses. Knowledge about how and when to refer to follow-on care. And there's a heightened need for ethics, understanding of ethics concerning confidentiality, because there's a lot of media attention around this research. It's important to be aware. Psychotherapy adds an increased need for confidentiality. So bringing us to today, what are we doing here this weekend? Why are we here? I want to offer a tool that I've found helpful navigating this evolution of psychedelic science. This is a model that Bruce Tuckman developed back in the 60s. I was first exposed to it as a project manager in corporate settings. Might be familiar to many of you. Some versions of this model have more steps, but for today, we'll use the 4-step model that begins with forming. This period is wonderful. It's the honeymoon period. We've referred to it often as the Renaissance. Very optimistic, expansive, idealistic time. And it feels a lot like being back in forming here in Sweden this week. Almost inevitably after forming, when more people apart from the core individuals who get things started come into play, you land in storming. In my opinion, that's where we are in the United States right now, and it's often uncomfortable. But there's a way to get through it, and you can participate in that this weekend. We're striving towards norming. If psychedelic science is a team effort, if there's this cohesive community, can we begin to document values to guide the larger effort that leads us to performing? Will we be able to transition to an era when the medicines are wisely and fairly made available for individual as well as collective health and well-being? And what would that look like? Let's take a look at an early normer. This is Lisa Bieberman. She's one of my heroes. She was a graduate student who volunteered in Timothy Leary's office at Harvard. And she wrote this wonderful pamphlet, I don't know if you can see. It was entitled Session Games People Play, a Manual for the Use of LSD. It's real thin. I highly recommend reading it. It's really good. She encouraged the community at the time back then to strive towards norming. I'll give you an opportunity to read that slide. So she wrote this in 1966, but then as things began to get out of control in the counterculture, she reflected back on what it felt like to be in the forming stage when she wrote in 1967. We were messianically dedicated, full of the happy excitement of sharing a soon-to-be public secret that was going to save the world. Maybe some of you today sharing that feeling. There are individuals who are striving towards norming now. And what does that look like? A couple examples. Janice Phelps published this paper on guidelines for the training of psychedelic therapists. I highly recommend it if you can get a copy. I included this slide of my first paper I ever published to encourage those of you who are students. I was just a student. I wrote it for a class assignment. My professor said, you should try to get this published. And what I was attempting to do was providing some guidelines for how to teach individuals in research settings how to set intentions. Often when you ask someone, what is your intention for this session, their eyes will roll up in their head, and they're trying to think of the clever thing that they're supposed to say. But Jean Gendlin's technique of focusing and looking for the felt bodily sense of what that wise inner healing intelligence is wanting is a technique that can be taught and learned. More recently, and I'll call out, tried to get tricky with the graphics. This article was not published in the Journal of Transpersonal Psychology. That was my paper. Peter Hendricks published in the International Review of Psychiatry recently on awe as potentially a mechanism for the underlying effects of the psychotherapy. Okay. Brief quote from his paper that I want to share with you. He says, speaking about why the psychotherapy component is essential, I drew on this quote, thus, it may be aw's need for accommodation that accounts for the Ebenezer Scrooge-like enlightenment and rebirth that are believed to accompany classic psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. And I sort of envisioned the therapists in playing a role like the Christmas ghosts who visited Scrooge to help him and support him with his life review and his motivation to change. So I worked in medical television years ago and created television programs on hypertension and diabetes and psychotropic medications, and it never included language about awe. Psychedelics are different. Very briefly, with the time remaining, I have some suggestions maybe that might inspire some of you here this morning. Where are we in need of norming around psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy? In addition to continuing to research new indications, we need to adapt and develop the interventions, adapt the therapy so that it's appropriate when combined with psychedelics, optimizing set and setting, increasing diversity. I have a word about diversity. It is very important in psychedelic science. It occurred to me that if over 360 million people worldwide have disabling hearing loss, what does it mean to provide psychedelic-assisted therapy for deaf people who can't hear music? How do you work with the about 285 million people globally who are visually impaired when so much of the psychedelic experience involves talking about visions and imagery? What's it like to work with people who cannot see? We created an entry point for the 1% to 2% of the population who are autistic. What about the 617 million who are aged 65 and over? How do we work safely in palliative care with elderly individuals? And a question that I'm uncomfortable with, but it keeps coming up, what about working with children? How young is too young? These are areas that still require some norming. There are countless numbers of ways to become involved in contributing to this effort, apart from being a psychotherapist or a researcher. We need people who can establish training standards, determining certification and licensing requirements, refining and developing the intake assessments so we can find individuals who are likely to be non-responders, so we can find out for whom these treatments are not indicated and help them get the treatment that they need. And expanding community-based participatory research. There's so many ways to get involved. And these are a few areas where I feel personally that clinician participation is essential. When you're developing protocols, get clinicians involved to review and help you develop them, evaluate safety measures and methods. Skipping over the ones I've already covered. Encourage clinicians to participate in peer reviews. They often offer, a unique perspective. We also need individuals to develop and validate new measures for this burgeoning science. And we also need clinician participation on advisory boards, boards of directors, ethics committees to help steer the larger effort. So to close, I'm going to end with the encouragement we often give our study participants before they participate in the medication sessions. I want to encourage all of you this weekend to trust, let go, and be open. In the spirit of Sweden opening to something new, step out of your comfort zone this weekend. Try it. practice openness. Let's not make hypocrites of ourselves. Psychedelics leave you so open. Do it. Explore outside your usual areas of interest. Go to the talks you ordinarily would not go to. Watch your friends and colleagues on videos later. If your primary interest is in the basic sciences, then attend talks on applied science. If you're a therapist, spend some time in the talks on neuroscience. To help you, send you on your way, just briefly, I'm going to encourage everyone here this morning to set an intention for this event. So if I asked you, what is your intention for this event? Watch. Do you look up towards the left hemisphere of your brain and think, oh, what am I supposed to say? Drop down into an awareness in the body of why you came here this weekend. What is it that you're really wanting from yourself? How do you want to grow? How do you want to learn?